This is the third video in my series about how I made my clicker makeup. This one covers the casting and seaming. Ideally, something like this would be made with foam latex as it's quite a large mask and you don't want it to be too heavy. So using foam latex would give you a lightweight, realistic mask. But there are no foam latex ovens in my city, so I used latex to create a skin and then filled it with an expanding soft polyurethane foam called S-Foam 40 by Barnes. This took me 2 days to do, but could be condensed into a day's work. To begin, I need to release my molds so that they can open up easily after running the piece. Two of my mold making friends informed me that dish soap is actually a really good release for this. You dilute it 1 part dish soap to 4 parts water, and then using a chip brush, you brush it into the surface vigorously to create bubbles. So the bubbles are the most important part. They're what help the stone to release the latex at the end of this process, creating a layer between the stone and the latex. Then I used a heat gun on low heat over the mold to help it dry faster to get to the next step. I found a heat gun to be a really helpful tool to use while doing this, especially the ones that you can control the temperature on, as it goes a lot cooler and a lot hotter than a hairdryer, and it's not as forceful or it doesn't blow as hard. It's more about the air temperature rather than the wind, so it dries without blowing everything everywhere, if that makes sense. Then I stippled on thin coats of latex using a chip brush. You can also use sponges, but I found the brush was easier to get into all the curves of this. So make sure you don't do it over the edge where the two halves will meet and join back together, as this will cause a massive seam line, but you can put it over the walls where the mold isn't going to be touching, as this does help the foam not to stick to the stone mold. It kind of acts as a release. I did 5 thin layers with the mold apart, so I was able to get the latex into the deepest parts of the mold, whereas if it was in one piece, like stuck 2 halves back together, I wouldn't be able to get my hand or my brush to curve enough to get in there properly. You can also pour liquid latex into the stone mold and swirl it around and then pour out the excess to ensure it is evenly coated and gets into every part, but this does leave a thicker layer of latex, which means it then also takes a lot longer to dry. With my thin stippling, I'm able to very quickly blow dry between each layer. I also did 5 layers of latex on my face positive as well, as this is going to be part of the mold. And in the very last layer, I added some fiberglass fibres into the wet latex so that when the foam was poured into it, the foam would have something to mechanically bond it to the latex, or else it could have easily delaminated or skinned while removing it from the mold, causing it to have a second skin. So there is also a product you can buy which chemically bonds the foam to the latex, but it is more expensive than using the physical properties of glass fibers to bond it instead. So make sure you do protect your fingers with gloves, as you can get little glass splinters if you don't. Don't ask me how I know this. It's also a good idea to protect your eyes from the glass fibers as well as your respiratory system. Just get familiar with the safety requirements of using glass fibers if you are going to be using it, as it can get a little bit dangerous. Then I put both halves back together. Make sure you do line it up properly, because once the latex touches the other latex, it will stick together. Once it's lined up, it is helpful to have a second pair of hands so one can push the halves back together tightly, while another uses tape to secure it all together. So use maybe half a roll of tape, so like a lot of tape, just to make sure the foam won't try to burst the mold open while it's expanding in there. Now I put 3 more layers of latex over the seam, down the center part, keeping it thin and blow drying between each layer, with the last layer also having fiberglass in it. This is the weakest part of my mold, or of my cast, so I really don't want it to tear during demolding. Now, to pour in the foam, we set up so we had everything ready to go. The mold has a quick release mold step around it, not yet done up. We had the mold secured with some bricks on either side. I had all of the parts of the soft foam pre-measured out. We worked out how much we needed by doing tests beforehand to work out its expansion size. You would need something like a mixing attachment for a drill to whip it up very thoroughly and very fast, as it only has a 7-second mix time and a 13-second pour time. I also had a pillow and a plastic bag nearby so I can sit on top of the mold once it's poured, as we had enough time to do the mold step around the outside of the mold, but not enough time to do one over the top, so we improvised and used my weight to close the top of the mold. So I had my gloves on. Double gloving can be useful here, so if you get too much stuff on one pair of gloves, you can remove it super quickly and have a pair of gloves underneath, saving time in these time-sensitive situations like this. It's also definitely recommended to use safety glasses while mixing stuff like this up. And with polyurethanes, it's also a good idea to wear a respirator if you're doing this a lot, as it does release very small amounts of gases that aren't good for you. A one-off is probably fine, but I mean, long term, if you're doing this kind of stuff, it is better to do full safety precautions for everything. So I poured both parts quickly into my mixing container and used the mixing attachment on the drill for 7 seconds, and then we quickly pushed the mixture into the mold with chip brushes, trying to get it into the deepest parts. After brushing it in for a couple of seconds, we stretched the mold slightly open and pushed the face positive in, making sure it was in the exact way that it was when it was molded. We don't have the keys in the head positive for this, which makes it a little bit harder to get it all exactly back in place. It's just a little bit of attention is needed when doing this. We strapped up the mold horizontally, and then I used myself as a quick weight on top to keep the foam from expanding too far out of the mold and to keep it denser. After sitting on the mold for maybe 15 minutes, I got up and there's only a small amount of foam leakage, which means we measured out a good amount. The next step is opening the mold, which is the most stressful part because you really hope it worked, that it's not locked and that it doesn't tear. So you need to take your time with it and be patient. It can sometimes take hours to open some molds. We started with the pry points with screwdrivers, gently pushing it open. If there's a lot of resistance, you might need to stop and try a different part. You can hear it when it starts to pop open, and it is the sweetest sound. There will always be one side which goes easier than the other, so once you've gotten that out, you can work it away from the other part of the mold with a brush and powder. I did get a couple of tears in some small areas where the latex was probably a bit too thin, but I can patch those when I seam this mask. Now that it's out, I powdered the masks to stop the latex from sticking to itself. Because the polyurethane produces a minuscule amount of harmful gases like isocyanate gas, you want to be safer than sorry and make sure there is no small amounts of it trapped by the latex skin. So squeeze your mask out a few times to release any trapped gases. This is important so that you're not wearing something harmful right up against your face and your skin. This is also another reason why I feel like this is not a beginner tutorial or a beginner material, as there are dangerous elements to effects makeup. It's not a toy. This kind of stuff should be done by adults. The next step is seaming. So first I got my nail scissors in and cut out any extra foam or latex from the edges, and then cut as much as the latex seam from where our two halves met. Then I used my Dremel and the cotton looking attachment to gently further refine and remove any extra latex seams. If you go too deep and rip through the latex, you can patch this also. Next, I went into the seams with some Bondo, which is a thickened Prosaide paste, to help smooth out the area and repair any areas that went a little bit too deep. I kept smoothing it out with a sponge dampened with isopropyl alcohol. You don't want this to be built up too high, as the goal is to make it not obvious where the seam in the mold was. Then lastly, I made up a mix of latex and Prosaide 50-50 and used it to go over the seam to try to smooth out the whole area and disguise where the seam was, using a disposable cheap brush, and I also used this to repair any areas that the latex was too thin or ripped coming out of the mold. I did 2 to 3 layers of this depending on how much each area needed repairing and reinforcing. I used my heat gun on a low heat to help dry between layers. Then I got out my individual resin teeth, which I bought on eBay. I think they're the cheap version of what dentures are made out of, and I used Prosaide to adhere them and Bondo to fill in the gaps and repair the gum line. I'm using a small disposable brush and isopropyl alcohol to help smooth this out. Then I powdered it all so it wouldn't be too sticky. Then I used my scissors to cut all the way through where that slit was sculpted in, so I have some vision while wearing this mask. And then I used my latex and Prosaide mix to seal the edges where I cut it. Now that the mask is all seamed and ready to go, the next tutorial will focus on pre-painting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.